Hello, everyone. We are going to get started on our last presentation, but first I would like to introduce our presenter. Amanda Taboas is an advanced doctoral student in the school psychology program at Illinois State University. She's currently working on her dissertation, which aims to identify the preferences of language in individuals within and outside the autism community, as well as the impact of language use on parental perceptions of school faculty members. Amanda's areas of interest include social communication and behavioral skills in children with ASD. Upon finishing her degree at Illinois State University, Amanda hopes to become duly licensed as a school psychologist and clinical psychologist. She hopes to one day work at a clinic specializing in ASD. Welcome, Amanda. We're so happy to have you, and I'm going to let you take it away from here.
Sorry, I was trying to unmute myself. Well, thank you for letting us present today. Today we'll be talking about identity first versus person first language, and we'll be focusing on preferences among autism stakeholders. So before we go into our current study, we'll be providing a short introduction and literature review, and then we will go into our purposes, methods, data and results, and implications of our current study. So as an introduction, the words that we use hold power, and the language choices that we make have social, emotional, and cognitive significance as language influences our thoughts and perceptions. As language is so important, the language that we use when referring to individuals with disabilities has changed over time as a result of advocacy and a search for humanity and equality. Specifically, we've changed the use of person-first language, or PFL. So person-first language works to actively change the language structure so that the person is placed in front of the disability. So for example, a person-first language term would be person with autism. In comparison, identity-first language focuses on that identity specifically. So a term for identity-first language may be autistic. So the overall goal of person-first language was to be used as an equalizer, to be used across all individuals, whether they had a disability or not, in order to create equal standards and opportunities for everyone. So while person-first language is used frequently across multiple settings, so in schools, clinics, and hospitals, some autism self-advocates and scholars have indicated and argued that autism is an identity-defining feature that cannot be separated from them, and that rather than being as beneficial as once thought, person-first language actually perpetuates stigmatization. So like I mentioned before, person-first language works to actively change language structure from what we typically see. So typically we see that structure of adjectives preceding nouns. However, with person-first language, this is not necessarily what we see. So by changing this language structure, individuals have argued that we are actually placing additional focus on the disability while simultaneously indicating that the disability is not actually as important. So when we think of terms of importance to us and identities of importance, such as being a parent or being an American, we're more likely to use person-first terms. So we're more likely to call someone a parent or refer to ourselves as a parent compared to a person with a child. And we're more likely to indicate that we're an American or someone is an American versus a person with Americanism. So when we think of these terms and we think about how those are topics and identities that are important to us and we actively change it for disabilities, many of these individuals feel like we are taking away the importance of that disability and the identity that they have. So rather than using person-first language, many have argued for the use of identity-first language. So here are two quotes by two autism self-advocates, which really illustrate the point that the identity of being autistic is really important to them. So within this first quote, it states, "Autism is a part of me. Autism is hardwired into the ways my brain works. I am autistic because I cannot be separated from how my brain works." The next quote states, "But I am autistic. These are not qualities that I have. They are part of who I am. Being autistic does not subtract from my value, worth, and dignity as a person. So both of these, again, illustrate that importance of being autistic to these individuals. They indicate that, it's not something that can be separated from them. And it's not something that does subtract from their value, their worth, or their dignity as a person. So these identities are important. So while identity first language has been argued for, those who oppose identity first language have argued that IFL is objectifying, it ignores individuality, it promotes essentialism, and it allows people with disabilities to be viewed as victims rather than individuals who have a disability, but also have other qualities and characteristics that are important. So going into just a brief literature review, as I mentioned before, person first language was created to be used as an equalizer to be used across all individuals. However, in scholarly writing, this is not necessarily the case. So in a study that was done in 2017, Corinne found that person first language is not always used equally in scholarly writing, and that rather it's used more when referring to children with disabilities compared to children without disabilities. And it's also used more when referring to more stigmatizing disabilities, specifically autism and intellectual disabilities, as compared to sensory disabilities such as being blind or deaf. And then when looking at preferences of language, generally there really isn't that much research done in this field. However, for research that is done within this, we can see that there really isn't a universally accepted way to describe or talk about autism. So the study that is cited the most when looking at this field of research is this Kenny et al. 2015 study, which was done in the United Kingdom. So within the study, Kenny and colleagues looked at surveying individuals within the autism community, including professionals, adults with autism, parents, family and friends, and they had them indicate terms that were preferred. And they found that professionals reported having a greater preference for person first language terms, and that adults with autism and parents to a lesser extent preferred identity first language terms. Similarly, in a study that was also done in the UK, just as part of the study, researchers had asked adults with autism whether they preferred an identity first language term, which was autistic, or a person first language term, which was person with autism. And they found that within the sample, 62% of these adults with autism preferred the identity first language term autistic. Similar results were also seen in Australia within a study that was done in 2020. Within this study, researchers had asked participants, adults with autism, to rate terms regarding their preference as well as how they viewed them as offensive. And they found that adults with autism preferred the terms person on the autism spectrum, autistic, and autistic person. The term autistic specifically was found to be highly divisive, as many individuals indicated that this was a highly preferred term, but many also indicated that this was a term which they found highly offensive. So within this sample specifically, that term autistic was really divided upon. So moving into the impact of autism acceptance on mental health, generally we see that individuals with autism have lower self-esteem and higher levels of depression and anxiety as compared to neurotypical individuals. However, research has shown that having a greater autism identification has led to higher personal and collective self-esteem, lower levels of depression and anxiety, and that having a greater autism identification may also serve as a protective mechanism. Additionally, research has shown that personal and external sources of acceptance, so acceptance from family members and friends, have also been led to decreasing levels of depression. They've also found that external sources of acceptance has also been correlated with decreased stress. So within both of those studies looking at mental health, we can really see that having a positive autism identification and having higher levels of autism acceptance really does impact mental health. So within our current study, we focused on a language preference survey. And the purpose of our study was to examine the language preferences of autism stakeholders and those with little to no experience with autism. So while we've seen that previous research has regarding language preferences have been done in the UK and Australia, there really haven't been done here in the United States. So as language does change based on countries, we wanted to see how language preferences were here in the United States. So regarding our method, we recruited individuals using an IRB approved message, which was posted on social media. It was posted on personal Facebook pages, as well as various Facebook groups related to autism and parenting. We also posted this message on various subreddits related to autism and the autism community. The only criteria that we did have was that all participants be US residents who were 18 years or older. Prior to beginning the study, all participants were provided an informed consent, and they were also provided just information about compensation and what was going to go on in the study. Participants were then asked to indicate their affiliation within the autism community, and they were allowed to select multiple affiliations, as we know that adults with autism can also be parents, professionals, and so on. But for the purposes of this study, for our data analysis, we used our hierarchy to categorize individuals, starting with adults with autism and then moving down. Given this categorization, we had a total sample size of 299 adults with autism, 81 parents of people with autism, 207 professionals, 44 family members and friends, and then 97 of those with little to no experience with autism. Regarding gender and age, the majority of our sample size were female. We had 516 female, 126 males, 21 who identified as transgender, 22 who were non-binary or agender, 35 who were genderqueer, 4 who indicated other, and then 4 who preferred not to answer. Regarding our age range, we had a pretty vast age range from 18 to 80, but our average age was around 32 years of age. Regarding ethnicity, the majority of our sample size were white. We had 598 who indicated that they identified as white, 45 Latinx or Hispanic, 38 Asian, 20 Black or African American, 2 American Indian or Alaska Native, 11 who were interracial, so 1 or more of these, 7 who were other, and then 6 who indicated that they preferred not to answer. So going into our measures, participants were asked to do 2 different tasks that we'll be talking about today. The first task was that participants were asked to rate terms to describe themselves or someone with autism. So they were provided with 10 terms, 5 IFL terms and 5 PFL terms. And they were asked to rate these terms on a 5-point scale, 1 being strongly dislike and 5 being strongly like. The next task had participants select just 1 term to refer to themselves or someone with autism. And again, they were provided with the same 10 terms and asked to select just 1 term which they prefer to use to refer to someone with autism. So below here are the terms that we used. The identity first language terms that we used included has autism, has high functioning autism, is autistic, is an autistic person, and is an ASPE. And then the person first language terms which we used included is a person with autism, is a person on the autism spectrum, is a person with ASD, is a person with low functioning autism, and is a person with Asperger's. So moving on into our hypothesis, the first one that we'll be talking about is our hypotheses for task 1, which was the rating terms. So we were hypothesizing that when participants were asked to rate terms on that 1 to 5 scale, 1 being strongly dislike to 5 being strongly like, that adults with autism were going to rate liking identity first language terms higher than person first language terms. In contrast, we were hypothesizing that professionals were going to rate liking person first language terms more than identity first language terms. We were also expecting a similar pattern for family members and friends and people with little to no exposure, where we expected them to rate liking person first language terms over identity first language terms. We were also expecting that parents would rate liking identity first language terms and person first language terms fairly equally, given past research that has been done. Next, with task 2, which was that select one term task, we expected that when participants were asked to select just one term from a list of 10 terms, 5 being IFL terms and 5 being PFL terms, that a greater percentage of adults with autism were going to select an identity first language term compared to a person first language term. And we were expecting that a greater percentage of professionals would choose a person first language term over an identity first language term. We were also expecting family members and friends, a greater percentage of family members and friends to choose a person first language term over an identity first language term. And we were expecting that same pattern here for people with little to no exposure to autism. For parents, we were expecting that a greater percentage of parents would choose a person first language term over a identity first language term, but we did also expect that parents would choose more, a greater percentage of parents would choose more identity first language terms compared to professionals, family members and friends, and people with little to no exposure to autism. So looking at our results for our first task or our first hypothesis, in order to analyze our data, we computed a mean rating score for the 5 IFL terms and 5 PFL terms for each of our participants. And then we did a 2x5 mixed ANOVA to look at those differences between language type and group. So these are the results which we found. We did find a significant interaction effect between language type and affiliation group. Specifically, we found significant results for adults with autism, professionals, family members and friends, and then those with little to no experience. Beginning here with adults with autism, we found that adults with autism rated liking identity first language terms significantly more than person first language terms. We also found that professionals rated liking person first language terms significantly more than identity first language terms. Similarly, we found that family members and friends rated liking person first language terms significantly more than identity first language terms. And that those with little to no experience also rated liking person first language terms more than identity first language terms. Similar to what we were expecting, we did see that there was no significant difference in parents where they rated liking identity first language terms and person first language terms fairly equally. Something interesting that I do want to point out before I actually move on is that our rating scale was from 1 to 5, 1 being strongly disliked to 5 being strongly like, and 3 was neither like nor dislike. So something interesting that we did see were that no one really loved any of the terms that we had. They were mostly in the middle, but there was that significant difference in which terms they did prefer. So moving on into our second task and second hypothesis, this was the one that had participants select just one term from that list of 10 terms that they would use to refer to themselves or someone with autism. To analyze this data, we did classify participants as either having selected an IFL or PFL term, and then we used a 2x5 chi-square test to find that association between language type and group. So these are the results that we found. We did see a significant association between language type and group. Beginning here with adults with autism, we had a total of 298 individuals for adults with autism. And we did see that a greater percentage of adults with autism chose a identity first language term compared to a person first language term. In contrast, we saw that for professionals, a greater percentage of professionals did choose a person first language term over an identity first language term. We saw that family members and friends did choose a greater percentage of family members and friends did choose a person first language term over an identity first language term. And for those with little to no experience, it was fairly equivalent, but a greater percentage of them did slightly like person first language terms a little more than identity first language terms. With parents here, we saw that parents did a greater percentage of parents did prefer an identity first language term over a person first language term, which is interesting because when we compare this to when they were asked to just rate terms and they rated them fairly equivalently, here we see that when they were asked to select just one term that they prefer to use, they do choose an identity first language term. So now moving into the specific descriptive terms which were selected across groups. So here is the graph that we have. At the bottom here, we have all of the descriptive terms. Sorry, don't know what's happening. Here we go. So down here, we have the descriptive terms that were all endorsed. So we have the first 5 here are identity first language terms, and the next 4 are person first language terms. We did not, the only term that we did not include here was person with low functioning autism, and that's because no one actually endorsed that one. So here within this chart, we see that adults with autism are in the blue, parents of people with autism are in the orange, family members and friends are in gray, professionals are in yellow, and then those with little to no experience are in green. So when we start over here with the term autistic, we had 94 individuals who endorsed this term when asked to select just one term that they would use. And we see a stark difference between adults with autism and the rest of these affiliation groups. So we had approximately 70% of adults with autism who did select this group, followed by parents, those with little to no experience, family members and friends, and lastly, professionals. So what's interesting here is that comparison between adults with autism and professionals, as adults with autism chose it the most or endorsed it the most, and professionals endorsed it the least. Next, within the term has autism, 104 individuals endorsed this term. The group which endorsed it the most were parents of people with autism, followed by those with little to no experience, professionals, family members and friends, and then lastly, adults. The next 3 terms which we have up here, which are identity first language terms, were not endorsed by many individuals. However, for the term has high functioning autism, we had 6 individuals who endorsed this term. The majority of them were adults with autism, followed by parents, family members and friends, and lastly, those with little to no experience. Something interesting here is that we didn't have any professionals who endorsed this term. Next, within the term autistic people or autistic person, we had 6 individuals again who endorsed this, the majority of them being family members and friends, followed by professionals and those with little to no experience. So within this term specifically, we didn't see any adults with autism or parents who were endorsing this. And lastly, for the identity first language terms, we had is an ASPE, and 1 person identified or endorsed this term, and that was a parent. Next, moving into the 4 person first language terms, which we have. The first term is person on the autism spectrum, and 95 individuals did endorse this, the majority of them being family members and friends, followed by those with little to no experience with the autism community, parents, professionals, and lastly, adults with autism. Next, when we move on into the term person with ASD, we had 64 individuals who endorsed this term. The majority of those were professionals, followed by those with little to no experience with autism, family members and friends, parents, and lastly, adults with autism. Next, within the term, which I think we see the most, especially in professionals or academia, the term person with autism. And this term was endorsed the most by professionals, followed by those with little to no experience with the autism community, family members and friends, and lastly, parents. Again, something interesting here is that no adults with autism endorsed this term, but this is the term that was endorsed the most by professionals. So again, you see that divide between what language adults with autism prefer and what professionals prefer. And then lastly, for the term is a person with Asperger's, we had 2 people who endorsed this, and they were family members and friends. So I think this graph specifically is just very interesting because it shows that divide between adults with autism and then those who are the closest to them, like parents and professionals, even family members and friends, where adults with autism do seem to specifically like the term autistic compared to the other terms that are used and endorsed by other groups. Next, we're looking at just the terms that adults with autism were endorsing. So here we had a sample size of 299, which make up this graph. And the terms that were endorsed include I am autistic, I am a person on the autism spectrum, I have autism, I have high functioning autism, and I am a person with ASD. So within this, we see that, again, approximately 70% of adults with autism were endorsing the term I am autistic, followed by these other terms. The descriptive terms that were not endorsed at all within this sample were I am an ASPE, I'm an autistic person, I'm a person with autism, I'm a person with Asperger's, and I'm a person with low functioning autism. So when comparing that to the terms that professionals endorsed using when asked to select just one term, we see that the terms that professionals were endorsing using included person with autism, person with ASD, has autism, person on the autism spectrum, autistic, and autistic person. So what's interesting here is that the term person with autism was endorsed the most at approximately 25%, followed by the rest of these terms. And the descriptive terms not endorsed at all included has high functioning autism, is an ASPE, and is a person with Asperger's. So again, when you look at those differences between language preferences, we see that the term person with autism here was endorsed the most, but when we move back to adults with autism, that was a term that wasn't endorsed at all for this affiliation group. So that's an interesting difference between them. And something that we did note was that professionals were endorsing the term autistic much more than we were actually even expecting. And while we don't know the exact reasons for this, it could be because this term and the controversy specifically surrounding identity first language and person first language is becoming more known. And by professionals having this awareness, they might be actively trying to work on using this term more, especially with maybe clients and those they serve who do use that language. So moving into our discussions and implications from our study, from the results that we found so far, we can see that person first language and identity first language are endorsed differently among autism stakeholders. Specifically, we've seen that adults with autism seem to like identity first language terms more than person first language terms. We've seen that professionals and family members and friends like person first language terms more than identity first language terms. And interestingly, while parents like person first language terms and identity first language terms equally, when they're asked to choose just one term that they're most likely to use, they prefer identity first language terms. Next, when we look at just adults with autism, we see that approximately 84% of adults with autism choose an identity first language term to refer to themselves. And that specifically 70% of these adults with autism chose to use the term I am autistic to refer to themselves. So given these results and seeing these differences, it's really important for us, analogous to pronoun preferences, to be asking people with autism how they want to be referred to. Even though we see from the results so far that adults with autism do have that preference for identity first language, some individuals did prefer person first language. And even for those who did prefer identity first language, while the majority of them preferred that term autistic, there were other terms that were endorsed as well. So we really can't use a blanketed statement for all individuals, and we can't really assume what they want to be referred to. Therefore, it makes sense to just ask them what their preferences really are. Next, as professionals are typically trained to use person first language, we see that difference between professionals and adults. However, we do see that the use of person-first language is inconsistent with what the majority of people with autism do prefer. And that really shows within our results where professionals preferred that term person with autism the most, whereas for adults with autism, that wasn't even a term that they were endorsing. So given these results, we really need to be cognizant of our language choices and what we're using, especially as language choice may be impacting our therapeutic outcomes, and it can really impact the relationships which we build with clients and those that we're working with. So it's just really important to remember the language choices that we're using and how individuals are interpreting this. Any questions?
Thank you, Amanda. We do have a question, and you kind of touched upon it in your implications. But one was, how should organizations come to understand the most appropriate use of language? This person would suggest taking the lead of the ASD community, which is a lot easier said than done, they commented.
Yeah, I really do think the best thing that we can do is just ask people. I do think it just does really vary person to person and family to family. I did get to talk to many individuals who were completing the study, which was really cool. And many of them did indicate that this is just a very personalized matter and it is going to vary. So I think just the best thing to do is really just ask everyone what they prefer.
Someone asked, how about for marketing purposes when you don't have, the individual right there to ask?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think that's something that I even had trouble with putting this presentation together, knowing, exactly what terms to use. And I don't know if I have an exact answer to that, honestly. I feel like it's maybe the easy answers to put in all the terms, to, have maybe like person with autism / autistic / whatever else. But that is a hard question, and I'm not necessarily sure what the best answer to that is right now.
All right, thank you. Let me check the chat and make sure there's nothing else in there. Did not see. Someone just said, have any autism self-advocacy groups taken a stand on a direction they would like to lean?
Yeah, so I don't know if there are groups specifically, but I have gotten to, again, just talk to many people who informally have groups, I suppose, but many of them are very much leaning towards identity first language. I've learned that many of them don't like specific organizations such as Autism Speaks and other organizations like that. So just from what I've seen so far and just being able to talk to people, it just does seem that they're leaning towards identity first language.
Great. And then lastly, we got a couple of requests if you'd be okay if we shared your PowerPoint. A couple of people are interested in looking at some of the data a little bit more closely.
Yeah, absolutely.
Great. Well, I mean, that is all we have. If you, yeah, no more question. Oh, hold on 1 second. Something popped up in the Q&A. Cursor's not working. Oh, yes, someone has said, yes, please send it our way.
Sounds good.
That's great. Well, thank you so much for sharing your study with us. We really appreciate it, and it made us think about what terms we're using and how to go forward from there.